From a very early age, we learn that there are parts of ourselves that don't match what's expected of us. A burst of anger we need to swallow, envy we hide even from ourselves, desires that seem wrong, ugly, inappropriate. Over time, we push all of this into a hidden place in our mind, as if we could erase these parts through sheer willpower. But what happens when we try to hide something within ourselves for so long? Carl Jung called this collection of rejected, forgotten, or denied aspects of personality the shadow. The shadow isn't inherently bad. It's not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of ourselves that was silenced so other parts could be accepted. When a child notices, for example, that their spontaneity bothers the adults around them, they may learn to control themselves to the point of losing touch with their own creativity. This repressed trait, which was once natural, becomes part of the shadow. The shadow, then, is everything we were forced to repress in order to adapt. It's shaped by what others said was right or wrong, beautiful or ugly, acceptable or shameful. But even when pushed away from consciousness, it doesn't disappear. On the contrary, it remains alive within us, acting silently, influencing our emotions, attitudes, and even decisions, even if we don't realize it. Jung believed that this hidden part of the self carries enormous potential for transformation, but only when we have the courage to face it head-on. Because what is repressed doesn't disappear, it only changes form. And when we insist on denying who we are, we begin to live in constant conflict, trying to be an idealized version of ourselves while struggling against feelings we cannot control. Understanding the shadow is like shining a flashlight inside a cave. Not to destroy what's in there, but to get to know and integrate what has been hidden. And this requires more than theoretical knowledge. It requires honesty, observation, and above all, a willingness to look at oneself without masks. The shadow is personal, intimate, shaped by each person's history. But it's also universal. We all have one. And all of us, at some level, try to avoid it. But why do we do this? What leads us to hide such human parts of ourselves to the point of forgetting they exist? The answer goes far beyond the individual. It lies in the structures that surround us, in the roles we're taught to fulfill, and in the expectations we learn to prioritize, even when they suffocate us.
Repressing the shadow is often a survival strategy. From an early age, we're exposed to rules, standards, and expectations that tell us what is acceptable to feel, think, and demonstrate. We grow up learning that certain emotions aren't welcome, that crying too much is weakness, that feeling anger is ugly, that having doubt or fear makes us less strong. Without realizing it, we begin to wear masks. And the more we wear these masks, the further we drift from who we really are. The family environment is usually the first stage of this repression. When a child shows sadness and is reprimanded with a "swallow your tears," they begin to understand that showing pain isn't safe. When a boy is praised only for being strong and never for being sensitive, he may learn to hide his vulnerability. And when a girl is constantly valued for being nice, she may end up suppressing her firmness, her righteous anger, her autonomy. But this repression doesn't just happen at home. Society as a whole educates us to follow certain models. We're expected to be productive, pleasant, controlled. We are shaped by cultural patterns that exalt only one part of the human experience, the light part, the one that can be shown in public, that can be applauded, that doesn't disturb. Thus, the shadow is pushed deeper and deeper. The fear of judgment is one of the main fuels for this denial. We have an almost instinctive desire for belonging, to be accepted by the group. And for this, we often sacrifice authentic parts of ourselves. We choose to show only what we believe others will approve of. And what doesn't fit, our impulses, vulnerabilities, wrong desires, is swept under the rug of the unconscious. This is where the shadow begins to gain strength. It grows silently, fed by everything we deny. And the more we ignore it, the more it influences us without our awareness. The need to always seem right, for example, may hide a deep fear of being wrong. The constant search for control may be a desperate attempt to suffocate internal chaos. And this accumulates, creating tension in our relationships, affecting our choices, sabotaging our well-being. The repression of the shadow isn't just an individual act. It's a collective adaptation. It's how we've learned to survive in a world that still struggles to deal with the complexity of being human. But even when repressed, the shadow doesn't disappear. It manifests, disguised, projected, camouflaged. And often, it's exactly in the moments we least expect that it finds a gap to express itself. And it's at this point that we begin to see the most evident signs. Behaviors that seem exaggerated, reactions we can't explain, harsh judgments we make without realizing. The shadow begins to emerge, not directly, but disguised in everyday attitudes. When the shadow isn't recognized, it finds other ways to manifest, often through behaviors that seem to have no logical explanation, but that carry within them a repressed pain, a denied impulse, a forgotten part of who we are. And it's at this point that the consequences begin to become visible, although they're still not understood by those who experience them. One of the most common behaviors of someone disconnected from their own shadow is constant judgment of others. Judging can be an unconscious way of pushing away something that, deep down, we recognize in ourselves, but refuse to accept. We criticize someone for being selfish, but perhaps we ignore our own desire to prioritize ourselves. We look with disdain at another person's vanity, but perhaps there's a part in us that would also like to be seen, admired, desired, and that has been silenced for a long time. This is projection, a psychological mechanism through which we attribute to others what we can't recognize in ourselves. By doing this, we feel a false sense of relief. The problem is with the other person, we think. But in truth, it's as if the shadow were trying to show itself through the mirror of relationships. It doesn't disappear. It only changes place, disguises itself as opinion, as indignation, as criticism. Moreover, the repression of the shadow often expresses itself as contained anger. Not the kind of anger that explodes and causes a scene, but the kind that accumulates inside, like a permanent tension, a silent discomfort. People who repress their negative emotions too much can become impatient, irritable, or emotionally distant, as if they were always fighting against something invisible. Another frequent symptom is self-sabotage. When we don't embrace important parts of ourselves, we feel fragmented. And, in this state, it's difficult to sustain healthy relationships, personal projects, or life goals. Something within the person always seems to pull in the opposite direction, as if they themselves were preventing their own growth. Often this sabotage comes disguised as procrastination, fierce self-criticism, irrational fear of success. And finally, there's perfectionism, which is rarely a genuine quest for excellence, but rather a desperate attempt to compensate for the feeling of inadequacy that the shadow carries. The person tries to be impeccable, irreproachable, unquestionable. But this effort almost never comes from lightness. It comes from the pressure of not letting flaws appear, because they know that, if this happens, perhaps something hidden will come to the surface. These behaviors don't come from nowhere. They are echoes of a denied part of the personality that, even rejected, continues trying to participate in the person's life. And the more they try to control it, the more this shadow escapes through the cracks, between the lines, through reactions. And it's at this point that the consequences begin to weigh. Ignoring your own shadow doesn't go unpunished. At first, it may seem to work. After all, the person maintains an acceptable image, controls their impulses, acts in an appropriate way. But over time, this repression begins to exact a price. And most commonly, this price comes in the form of internal conflicts that we can't name, as if something is always misaligned inside. The truth is that living in constant denial of parts of yourself creates a silent but constant friction. It's like trying to walk in shoes that no longer fit. You can still walk, but each step hurts. Many people feel a kind of restlessness with no apparent cause, an emptiness that can't be explained, an emotional discomfort that doesn't cease, no matter how much they try to change jobs, cities, or relationships. Because the problem isn't outside, it's in what was left behind within them. This prolonged repression of the shadow can lead to identity crises. At some point, the person no longer knows if what they show to the world is, in fact, who they are. They become confused with the roles they play, the competent professional, the reliable friend, the ideal partner, but feel that something essential is missing. The disconnection from their own authenticity creates a constant feeling of incompleteness. And this opens space for feelings like anxiety, insecurity, and a persistent doubt about their own worth. And when this inner tension doesn't find a healthy channel of expression, it overflows into relationships. A tendency begins to emerge to attract or become involved in dysfunctional dynamics, where, without realizing it, the person seeks in others what they don't recognize in themselves. Often they project onto their partner, boss, or even friends the aspects they hide from themselves. And then come the frictions, the repetitive cycles, the arguments that always seem to be about the same thing, but which in reality are just unconscious attempts by the shadow to be heard. Jung said that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The shadow acts exactly like this, as an invisible force that shapes our steps behind the curtains. It influences decisions, sabotages relationships, leads us to choices that, later, seem senseless, all without us noticing its presence. And even in the small things of everyday life, in automatic gestures, in impulsive comments, it is there. You just need to observe more carefully to realize that this hidden part of our being is always trying to reveal itself, not in a scandalous way, but subtle, everyday, camouflaged in the details. The shadow doesn't need major events to manifest itself. In fact, it appears almost always in the most ordinary moments. It's there, in everyday conversations, in automatic thoughts, in actions we take without thinking, that it reveals how much influence it still has over our lives. The great challenge is that we are so accustomed to protecting ourselves from certain truths that we don't notice when we are acting in their name. Imagine, for example, someone who always appears kind, understanding, and helpful to everyone around them. On the outside, everything seems balanced. But inside, this same person may carry a growing irritation, a feeling of exhaustion, or even a silent resentment. And this happens because part of them, the part that would like to say no, to take a stand, to set boundaries, was thrown into the shadow. Good manners became armor, and legitimate anger, which could be channeled in a healthy way, turned into a ghost that manifests as chronic fatigue, impatience, or sudden outbursts. In the work environment, this dynamic is even more evident. How many times does someone sabotage themselves out of fear of making mistakes, not wanting to disappoint, wanting to appear perfect in the eyes of others? The shadow, in this context, can reveal itself as procrastination, creative blocks, anxiety crises before meetings or important decisions. It's the unconscious saying, "I am not just this image that you are trying to maintain." And on social media, the shadow appears in the constant desire for validation, in silent comparison with others, in the impulsive judgment of those who live differently from you. Sometimes the acid criticism of a shallow influencer is just a reflection of discomfort with one's own repressed vanity. Or that sudden hatred towards someone who seems too free may hide an unadmitted envy, a deep desire to live with more authenticity. The shadow also manifests in the most intimate relationships. When we demand too much from the other person, when we expect them to fill something we can't even name, when we feel suffocated, abandoned, or misunderstood. Often, it's not the other person who is frustrating us. It's our own unacknowledged part that is projecting its needs and fears. We love with what we have of light, but also with what we have of shadow. And that's why, without this conscious awareness, we end up hurting those we most want to protect. Jung teaches us that integrating the shadow isn't about eliminating it, but recognizing its existence and learning from it. It's about giving space for it to express itself consciously, without taking control of our lives behind the curtains. Because as long as we continue pretending it doesn't exist, it will continue deciding for us, in the choices we make, in the words we use, in the paths we avoid. Recognizing your own shadow is one of the most challenging, and at the same time most liberating paths of self-knowledge. It's not about becoming someone perfect or totally enlightened, but about accepting that we are made of contrasts, light and darkness, strength and vulnerability, reason and impulse, and that ignoring any part of this fragments us. By bringing to light what was repressed, we don't become someone worse, but rather more whole. The shadow ceases to be a threat when it is understood. And it's in this process, sometimes uncomfortable but deeply transformative, that we begin to live with more truth, more awareness, and more compassion, with others, but mainly with ourselves.